What should new managers do first? There's so many things that you can do, but you can't do it all, especially not at once. And it can be really helpful to keep it simple. So in this video, I'll show you how 2 questions, asked in different ways, can help you get a head start as a new manager. And if you're watching and you're like, okay, I'm a manager, but I'm not new, keep watching, because at the end, I'll show you how you can use these questions, even if you've been leading people for years. And if you're watching and you're like, great, but I'm not a manager, keep watching as well, because I'll show you how you can use these questions, even as an individual contributor, so someone who doesn't manage a team. But first, okay, new managers. When you become a manager, at times you may feel like you have to have like a different persona, be a different person. But that's a miss, because the reason that you got into this role is who you are and your experiences today. And so not really taking time to reflect on those can often be a common thing people do because they're so focused on becoming this new person in this new role. But take a minute and think about that. Because the 2 questions that you'll be asking are 1, what do you wish more people knew about your role? And 2, what advice do you have for me? And the first person you're going to start with is yourself. And yes, I'm serious. But this is a time for self-reflection. And so in the first saying, what do you wish more people knew about your role, is to think about your career to date. Whether you've been an individual contributor for a long time, so worked and now managed people, or if you've had a short career and you're moving into management and you're super nervous because you're like, I didn't think I'd get to this point so far. But thinking about your experiences and what you wish more managers knew about your role. And things like that, from the technical aspect to things like requesting time off, or when you don't know, do I respond to this email? If you go to a conference, like, am I supposed to work at night? How do I do these things? So thinking about a lot of those times in your career before you became a manager and what that looked like and what you would wish that managers knew and had proactively communicated. Maybe there were questions you asked and you wish they'd said those proactively. Maybe there were questions you never asked because you're like, I don't know how to ask these. Those can be the really good questions for managers to really talk to their teams about the realities of working. And so giving yourself that advice to reflect on those experiences. And the second being, do you have advice for me? So using question number 1 can help to think, what advice would you give? So forget that this is you for a minute and pretend like you're talking to a friend. What advice would you give them as a manager? And how can you internalize that? So that can be a great place to start. The second is to talk to other managers. So maybe these are other within your same department or others within different departments, and asking them those same questions. What do you wish more people knew about your role, and what advice would you have? You can either say for me or for a new manager. And why this can be helpful is within your department, you may have people that are in a very similar role as you, and so it can be helpful to learn from them quickly. But also, there may be managers in completely different roles. So why it can be helpful to have these questions is also building relationships within your same department and with other teams. Often departments can be like silos, meaning that you work with each other, you may have like almost rivalries with other departments. And so building those relationships, often anchored on, again, hearing what they have to say. Like, how often does somebody in your career ask you, what do you wish more people knew about your job? Probably not often, if at all. And so taking the time to have these can be helpful because these are your go-to questions. And saying to leaders, like, I really want, again, to get a new head start as a manager and learn from others. People appreciate that, and that can help. So then when you're working with people, like leaders in other teams, or your teams are working together, it can help because you have that built-in relationship and also that knowledge from someone who you may not have even worked with closely before. So then talking to your team. So in talking to your team, one of the most powerful things really is asking questions. Because again, you may feel like in this persona, you're the leader, like, oh, here I am. But often think about yourself. Are there times do you wish that managers had asked your opinion or asked for what you thought or given you more of an opportunity to speak up? Probably. And so that's something that you can do even as a new manager. And so one of the most powerful things can be asking those questions and asking your teams, what's something you wish someone knew about your role? And what advice would you have for me? Now, when you're talking to your team, it is important as a manager to recognize that there can be power dynamics. In some organizations, it's not that way. And you're like, no, we have great relationships among managers, employees, teams, all that. But a lot of times you may think that, but it's not 100% true. And so with power dynamics, that can mean people may have those feelings. Like they don't want to speak up, or they're questioning, like, what's this really all about? Is my new manager trying to shake things up? Because when people don't have the information, especially as an employee when their boss is asking them questions, they often assume the worst. Like, what, am I going to be let go? What's happening? And that's just a natural human instinct that's really important for you to recognize as a manager. And so talking to your team and having those same questions and saying, I'm asking because I want to take the opportunity to make sure that as I'm leading the team, my real priority is helping you do your job, do it easier, do it better, and help your life at work and what I can do for it outside of work, because I know there's ripple effects. And so I want to give that opportunity to hear what you have to say. In recording these things, even telling them, like, I want to write it down so I can keep track of these. Because often telling employees exactly what you're doing can be helpful. And also asking your team members or telling them, these are the same questions I'm asking to senior leadership, because I want to hear from everyone, different people, what people wish they knew about their roles and any advice that they have. Why this is important is you may not always realize that just like in that power dynamic, a lot of times employees in their roles can feel like second or third or fourth or lower class citizens, like they don't feel like they have that voice. And so already by giving them this opportunity, they can really help to give them, help them feel seen and heard in ways that they don't always do. But also, a lot of times when you tell them you're having the same conversation with them that you are with senior leadership, it can make them feel a lot more valued. And so filling in these gaps. So the last, we'll talk about at the end of what you do with that information going back to your team. And having these conversations truly with senior leaders. So having conversations with managers above your level, but also with senior leadership. So your boss, other senior leaders. And no, I'm not suggesting that you set up a calendar appointment with every single manager in your organization if it's large. It's definitely not feasible, and it depends on what that looks like. But taking the time to really identify, and again, having people you're familiar with, but also people that you're not, or people that you admire and want to hear their take on. Those are some questions, and you can truly have that conversation in 5, 10, 15 minutes. It may stretch into 30, but it doesn't have to take a lot of time out of everyone's day. But telling those senior leaders, this is my first role in management, and I don't know, thinking back what it was like when you started, but if there's things now that you have advice for that you wish you'd known then. It can really be a helpful way to get information, build relationships, and also to boost your confidence. Because you're not going into these conversations thinking about what am I going to say in each one. You know 2 questions to ask. But also taking inventory of these and taking different lessons. And it can be helpful to your teams. I often say, when I'm doing leadership trainings, I tell people, tell your team that you're doing this leadership training. People often are don't tell their teams, I don't know if you feel like it's weird or a thing, or embarrassed I'm taking this class. It's great. And teams want to know that. So the same as you're telling your teams, hey, I'm asking you for advice, same with other managers, senior leaders. They'd love to know what other leaders would say. Most would, again, depending on that advice. But talking more about these in conversations and even saying to a point to your boss, I got a lot of really helpful tips. Would this be something that's helpful to put together for new managers? Because a lot of what I do is manager training for new and experienced managers and all of that. But I often say also in your organization, you can get some of that information to supplement that as well. And so thinking about ways you can put that together. It can be really easy. It doesn't have to become a whole project that you're okay, Ashley, now I'm spending my whole weekend doing this. But asking these standard questions, again, starting with yourself, including making sure it's other managers, your team, senior leadership, your boss. But this can be a really helpful way to get you a head start that so many never take the opportunity to ask. So I mentioned, even if you're not a new manager, to use these. Well, that's because even if you've been in role a really long time, you may think, I've never exactly had this conversation. And so thinking about that, especially with your team, it is never too late, not just to change the type of leader you want to be, but just to have little conversations with your team, to ask them for their opinion. And so as a manager, even if you're experienced, if you haven't had these conversations with your team, setting them up and asking. And it's really important to give that context to say, I was thinking about things like maybe I wish I knew more about your role, and I had never asked this question, and I wish I'd asked it a while ago, but figure today's better time than never. It can be a really quick way to do away with any discomfort you might feel about okay, is this weird? But again, telling your team why you're asking that. And also with other leaders as well, including if there's some that, again, you may have had those departmental rivalries with. So again, if you're an individual contributor, the last thing I'll say is those are 2 questions that can be helpful as you work with others. Within your team, on other teams, it can be a way to build relationships. So even if you're a manager, talking to your team members and saying, those are 2 questions that can be helpful to ask for others, especially across departments. So I hope these are helpful. And again, plenty of things you can do as a new or experienced manager. But these can be a great start.